From our archaeomega research group in ancient Egypt, some of the stars in the celestial vault were among the main gods and goddesses of that extraordinary culture, but above all their main god was the sun, the one that shone the most brightly, what they called Ra, Horus or Aten. And we are going to discover a great story because thanks to the discoveries of our research group of unprecedented and extraordinary alignments between some monumental elements on the Giza Plateau, with astronomical events such as solstices and equinoxes, we have been able to decode the intricate astral world immersed in the Giza Plateau since even older times. Those alignments between a monument, tomb or observation altar, as in megalithic times, were located between dolmens and large tombs like that of Stonehenge. With these astronomical events, they constituted for those ancient cultures species of openings of certain symbolic exit and entrance doors. And we are going to show you an unprecedented world full of symbologies that we have discovered, in which the great Sphinx of Giza was the main protagonist, the guardian of those symbolic doors. Any kind of geographical orientation is given in relation to the position of the observer and through our detailed investigations. Something that we have been able to understand is Allah, in all probability, the function of the rimmed hole that he had at the top of his head as the main altar for the observation and monitoring of those astronomical events of the sun, and to celebrate services of those rituals of opening the solstitial and equinoctial doors. And it's totally impossible that there can be chance in this. First, he had already made himself noticed by a photograph published shortly before sunset on the equinoxes. It rested on the shoulder of the Sphinx, but there is no fixed and prominent concrete backside located from where the sun can be seen on the shoulder of the Sphinx, and this is extremely important. Since this is so, this alignment can be considered strictly topographical. You move from side to side until you can get that picture. Thus, it was essential to look for that perfect backside that acted as a primordial observation point and at the same time was an altar to ritualize the symbology that equinox had, that of spring and that of autumn. But there is also a very important fact, and it is another alignment that occurs between some point related to the Sphinx and the extraordinary sunset that occurs right in the middle of the separation of the bases of the two great pyramids, and therefore the first great evidence that precise backside, observation point, ritual altar, was found in the hollow that edged the top of the head of the Sphinx, because it has been presented to us as a totally equidistant place to align with the sunset at the equinoxes and the summer solstice. The strategy of that prominent point was total, and so that this can be considered with scientific data, it was studied how the line from where the sun was observed to set on the equinoxes through the southeast corner of the pyramid of Khephren, and the line from where the sun was observed to set on the summer solstices. Just in the middle of the space between the two great pyramids, they crossed exactly in the altar hollow located at the head of the Sphinx, becoming this important altar ambivalent where the pertinent rituals would be officiated during both astronomical ephemeris of position, during the equinoxes and solstices, becoming the great Sphinx a guardian and symbolic intermediary between the also symbolic equinoctial and solstitial gates, and from that altar on the head of the Sphinx, the geographical orientation towards the west was this. At the equinoxes, the sun rises just in the geographic east and sets in the geographic west. Then the sun rises on the summer solstices near the northeast and sets near the northwest. At the winter solstice, it leaves near the southeast and sets near the southwest, so that each of these astronomical positional events were considered sacred moments, favorable moments in which a kind of transition could be exercised. moments in which the opening of certain doors that united this earthly world with the divine and the Sphinx occurred. It had been dedicated to the solar cult of the god Ra. Being the guardian of those solstitial and equinoctial doors, her function as a symbolic intermediary between this earthly world and the divine was also very important. We have several examples in the iconography that relates the Great Sphinx to the lotus flower, the one that for them symbolized the opening and closing of the solar gates, since it was believed that it had the power to connect the earthly world with the spiritual, so it was presented to the Great Sphinx. As the bearer and guardian of those symbolic solar gates, most probably oracle rites were also performed from that altar at symbolically auspicious moments in those important astronomical events. There is a reference that on one occasion someone spoke from inside that hollow, and it seemed that the Sphinx itself was speaking and in the cleaning of sand that covered almost the entire Sphinx. Several stelae were found with references to the hearing aid, suggesting that one of the functions to be performed next to the Sphinx was to listen to what it symbolically said, as was ritualized in the oracles. And you also had to look at that sunset beyond on the steep horizon, and it was in the southeast corner of the pyramid of Khephren where the sun set on the equinoxes.
What was really there? Well, inside from the altar. Right on that side was what is today called the subsidiary pyramid, and which in this extraordinary archaeoastronomical work we can from now on call the Pyramid of the Equinoxes. Indeed, the sun was introduced that important day through that small pyramid of which only its remains are today. But, in addition, these archaeoastronomical studies confirm as an important issue related to that symbolic equinoctial gate in that corner of the pyramid of Khephren, that there were also the pits of the solar boats in that area, and that they were related to the rites to the sun at the equinoxes, which were officiated from the head of the Sphinx through this alignment with the equinoctial setting. And that all this was completed with the, in these cases, essential alignment when ritualizing these events with the alignment on the day of the equinoxes, between the Sphinx, the small pyramid of the equinox, today the so-called subsidiary pyramid of Khephren, the moats of the solar boats, the mysterious moat of the tomb of Osiris from where the sun could be seen rising on the horizon and head of the Sphinx. Only the days of the equinoxes and Campbell's tomb count in its upper frame, an attached backside, but integrated into that structure that, being closer to the Sphinx, the sun was seen settling on his head shortly after its departure and following the angle of the sun's rise.
So the Archaeomega team, which has carried out this important research, Archaeoastronomica is pleased to be able to offer an extraordinary and unprecedented proposal on the possible development of that rite of the solar boat, that special day of the equinox equilibrium, the one in which the daytime and nighttime hours were perfectly balanced, 12 daytime hours and 12 nighttime hours, as we have already pointed out. This important rite of the solar boat was officiated from the hollow altar located at the head of the Sphinx, shortly before the sun set on the day of the equinoxes, and only that day did the Sphinx project the shadow from the top of its head. Where was the priest officiating the rite in what we call from now on the equinoctial gate of the temple of the Sphinx, so that this was possible with millimeter accuracy. This ancient temple of the Sphinx, strangely, if its ritual motif in this process and its archaeoastronomical connotations were not now known, had been built not centered before the Sphinx, but slightly out of square to the south, the priest strategically located at that gate, equinoctial of that important temple when the god Ra saw the sun. Standing just before his laying on that one equinoctial day, right at the head of the priest who was at that important altar of the head of the Sphinx, gave the opportune blessings for the beginning of the rite of the solar boat. The priest who stood on that high altar then turned towards the western horizon and witnessed how the sun god Ra landed on the small pyramid of the equinoxes. On the south side of the pyramid of Khephren, and symbolically collected, as is said in several ancient writings on the right of the solar boat, the deceased to put him on the solar boat to which they boarded bound for the underworld, to the Duat through that equinoctial door that opened symbolically through its magical alignment with the head of the Sphinx and is extraordinary. How does that first introduction to the solar boat Duat lead directly to the second door to go through? The Duat was formed of water through which that boat would sail and stops at a kind of pier where they are received by the god Osiris, who gets on the boat with them in order to protect them. This occurs in what is today known as the Tomb of Osiris, whose aforementioned pier, surrounded by water, is on its third level. The deepest, about 30 meters deep. From the boarding of Osiris in the solar boat of Ra, the symbolic and random journey through the underworld occurred, until the boat passed through the last door, located in the depths of what is known as Campbell's tomb, very close to the Sphinx. That door was dismantled, but a drawing made when it was discovered is preserved. This one we show here, and why has it been possible to link the so-called Campbell tomb in the development of this exciting rite officiated from the altar of the head of the Sphinx? Well, because finally from a small altar located on the southern edge of the entrance to Campbell's tomb, the last magical equinoctial alignment is finally observed. Let us remember that every link opens symbolic doors. And ritual roads are presided over by perfect alignments in these important astronomical positional events. Already from this last altar, observation point or archaeoastronomical backside, they saw how the sun was reborn again just to the geographical east, passing through the head and extraordinary altar of the Great Sphinx, where the priest blessed that symbolic journey that it represented. The daily cycle of life, death and rebirth, symbolizing the eternal struggle between math order and chaos, ending with the 12 daytime journey of the solar boat with the sun god Ra after those other 12 nighttime hours through the underworld, the Duat random and full of sacred trials and excessive struggles. Let's now look at surprising and totally unpublished details. From the investigations carried out by our Archaeomega group on certain physical elements already known on the Giza Plateau, but which had never been related to the symbolic process of the journey of the important solar boat of Egyptian mythology, we are going to begin with the extraordinary function that we have discovered that it held in the important rite of the solar boat on the days of the equinoxes of equals, 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. The small pyramid that was next to the middle of the southern base of the pyramid of Khephren. Small pyramid that from now on we will call the pyramid of the equinoxes. Of that small but now important pyramid of the equinoxes, practically nothing remains. Its square base, its two originals centered downwards, and some large pieces of stone from what was its old structure later dismantled. Probably to take advantage of their materials. Its main entrance descending towards the mother rock of the plateau was oriented north, precisely towards the V-shaped solar marker between the two pyramids where the sun entered on the days of the equinox, looking from the altar above the head of the Sphinx symbolically, so that the sun, the god Ra, penetrated through that descending. After climbing into the solar boat that was in one of the pits of that area of descent to the underworld, to the Duati, That descender from the main entrance ended up in a small room that was found empty, but precisely something that can surprisingly corroborate our theory is found at the other descending entrance to this little pyramid of the equinoxes. Second downhill entrance that is open to the west. Just to the geographical west where the sun sets on those important days of the equinoxes. Well, at the end of that descent open to the geographic west, even though that descent was deliberately obstructed by rocks as a plug so that one could not physically descend, in those cases we have come to the conclusion that despite being blocked the conduit, like the doors within the conduits of the Great Pyramid, they were no obstacles for the K or spirit of the dead to be able to transcend through the path traced by those gaps after the archaeologists unclog that drop in the final part. It was a surprise to find a hermetically sealed wooden box that generated expectation that, of course, it would contain a possible treasure. But it wasn't entirely enigmatic. In that wooden box, hermetically closed and its access blocked, were found multiple bars, also made of wood, which our Archaeomega group has made us think of a kind of correlation with the solar boats, which also represented them in wood, of course, for its buoyancy, even if they were symbolic waters of a duat or underworld. Then those wooden pieces could be put together as a whole. And guess what? Well, yes, it turned out to be a representation of the habitat of the silhouette of a solar boat, although this is also an unpublished conclusion of Archaeomega. Because yes, the proposal that was made was that it could be a cabin to transport a symbolic statue of the K, but of course without relating it to those in the solar boats. And now our theory fits even more. Let's see. The god Ra travels from dawn on the horizon with a perfect azimuth. This geographical we are on the day of the spring or autumn equinox, the only days in which there is the balance granted by the goddess Ma'at of 1200 pas on each daytime and 12 nocturnal. Every day the sun Ra takes a determined trajectory, and on the day of the equinoxes when it is almost there to reach the end of its diurnal journey. And by the exclusive trajectory of that important day, his shadow and that of the priest at the altar of his head is deposited on the altar. At the head of the Sphinx he is introduced through the equinoctial door of the temple of the Sphinx, where another priest located there gives the blessing to the rite of renewal of the spirit K of the deceased in the period of 6 months after the previous equinox. The priest of the altar on the head of the Sphinx turns towards the place where the sun is going to enter through the horizon. The daytime sun Ra climbs into a solar boat located in the corresponding pits and enters between the pyramid of Khephren and the small pyramid of the equinoxes. In it he picks up the wooden cabin of the box at the bottom of the second downhill entrance, the one facing west, and picks up from the room at the bottom of the entrance open to the north, the spirit K of the deceased, which he climbs into the boat and protects him in the habitat, a wooden protector installed, and they go down to the underworld, to the Adwat, to first moor the boat in the pier located in the waters of the depths, in the so-called Tomb of Osiris, and there, that important god of darkness. Osiris gets on the boat to protect the spirit K of the deceased, in the company of the now aged day god Ra. From there they prepare to cross the different doors of the underworld, physically represented by the wells that are on the Giza Plateau, to already line those that are located before the last and important door, the one located in the depths of what has been called Campbell's Tomb. Doors that no longer physically exist, but that we have drawings made. When the sand of such an important site was cleared, our Archaeomega research group definitely discovered that that was the last door before the definitive rebirth of the Ka of the deceased, because from an altar that was next to the mouth of that important well, it was from where the sun Ra was seen for the first time. Leaving the horizon just to the geographical east and landing for the first time on the altar at the head of the Sphinx. From there it would be when the boat's journey began. Daytime solar with the total renewal of the solar god. Hera once left in the Duat, in the underworld, to the god of darkness. Osiris, all of it.
Development of this extraordinary rite of the solar boat was carried out in this specific area of the Giza Plateau, between the Sphinx and its annexed temples and the southeast base of the Khafre pyramid was the perfect area because its limestone subsoil contained the layer of crystalline waters, which were the extension of the water table of the Nile from the 30-meter depth to which it was at the bottom of the tomb of Osiris, entrance to the aqueous underworld and exit from it through the Sphinx, whose water is only about 3 meters below it. The Archaeomega research team discovered the high level of knowledge they had when it came to fixing the perfect astronomical position alignments. The situation perpendicular to the base of the west side of the pyramid that stops the one where the Great Sphinx was located was not the most centered, as almost everything used to be done in that planning, but rather somewhat deviated from its center was done based on that. The true geographical west at the equinoxes was located on the hypothetical line of the sea horizon. So from the altar at the head of the Sphinx, in order for the sun to be hidden by the small pyramid of the equinoxes and by the southeast corner of the pyramid of Khafre, it had to be that and only that the location and height of the altar above the head of the Sphinx, and definitely so that you could also have an alignment already seeing the sun rise over the head of the Sphinx on the day of the equinoxes. The base observation altar had to be situated, as they did so perfectly, at the top of Campbell's tomb, on a line slightly to the left of the elevation of the sun from geographic east. That equinoctial day from the sea horizon, an elevation that passed at an angle with respect to the vertical of 30 degrees, which were those of the northern latitude of Giza. Those extraordinary knowledge of positional astronomy also made them build the Temple of the Sphinx, not perfectly centered with the extension of the Sphinx, but somewhat deviated from it, since this extraordinary temple was not in structural function with the Sphinx, but with something subtle and sacred, with the extension of the shadow of the head of the Sphinx and its crowned altar, thanks to that premeditated situation, and at the lowest level of the temple floor with respect to the legs of the Great Sphinx, the shadow of the head of the Sphinx, shortly before sunset at the corner of the Pyramid of Khafre, was projected towards the gate of the equinoxes of the temple, and shortly before sunset between the two great pyramids, on the day of the summer solstice, the shadow of the head of the temple, and shortly before sunset between the two great pyramids, the day of the summer solstice, was introduced through the summer solstice gate of the temple. And shortly before sunset, on the days of the winter solstice, temples were built throughout several dynasties, until the temple of Amenhotep was left, so that in a spectacular way the shadow of the head and altar entered through the door of the temple and came to touch the great stele door from within. And with this we leave another valuable information for a next documentary based on the rite during the solstices, also with the altar on the head of the Sphinx and, of course, with herself as its main protagonists.